Good evening. Close enough. This is the 18th installment of this series. Almost always, it would seem, I preface these videos with the admonition to start at the beginning. Watch the original, the woman with 1.5 hands first, the second one second, etc. But I don't know. It might not hurt to skip around. For instance, the more statistics-oriented vids of this series start at Part 4, subtitled A Different Approach, and go through Part 9, subtitled Reaching Out versus Being Reached. These 6 videos are where I use stats gathered from accredited feminist sources and, without changing any of their numbers, provide a different analysis that reveals a qualitatively different way of looking at rape prevention and points toward new ways that can actually lower the number of women who get raped here in America. That said, if someone just jumped right into Part 4, I'm sure my Walmart Chiefs paradigm would throw them for a loop if this same someone had not already viewed videos 1, 2, and 3. So, well, anyway, here's Part 18, or Coitus Interruptus. Last time I ended with a discussion of the second most effective suicide-reducing mechanism that Emil Durkheim outlined in his book Suicide, which, as I said then, begs the question, if that's second, what's first? The most effective suicide-reducing mechanism Durkheim wrote about had to do with economic depression. But note, that's a starting point. Economic depression raised 19th century suicide rates, which I updated to the modern American equivalent of an increase of 34%, details of which are located in parts 16 and 17 of this series. So here one might think we want to harness the suicide-reducing power of the opposite of economic depression, but we don't, because the opposite of economic depression is a bull market, also associated with a slight or modest increase in suicides, many of them of the nouveau riche variety. What's beyond our current purview, and questionable on many levels, is a return to the barter system, i.e. doing away with all bull and all bear markets. Durkheim never took that tack, and neither am I. The idea, then, is to, instead of attempting to do away with the entire market, to pursue the opposite societal effect of economic depression. But is that pursuable? Is it attainable, even theoretically? Yes, pursuable, and yes, attainable. Durkheim takes us there in a jiff, and spoiler alert, it involves integration. Details to follow, but first, say he did do a good job of showing us how to corral the opposite societal effect of economic depression, and to the extent that this effect was harnessed in the past just happens to correspond, perhaps coincidentally, perhaps not, to a lower suicide rate. Simply put, and for the sake of argument, say he proved his point. The question would still remain, would this effect be transferable to rape prevention? Yes, but not as easily or as readily, other than to just call it the war on the negative effects of economic depression and plug in the war-oriented solutions that I mentioned in Part 17. That would be the easy way. Another way to plumb for transferability is a bit more involved, but it's worth a separate analysis. In other words, during war, there's an obvious or easy-to-see linking of arms among fellow citizens. Many who otherwise would have committed an egotistic or self-oriented suicide don't, and they instead become more strongly integrated with others loyal to the same nation. The rationale behind "I don't want my teammate to die in a war" easily translates to "I don't want my teammate to be raped during a war." Teammates, to be awesome teammates, need to be both alive and in good working order, not to mention that 9 months after being raped, that teammate might die while giving birth. Anyway, As it pertains to war, transferability of a Durkheimian suicide prevention principle to a rape prevention principle is easy to envision. People link arms, we all need each other, we're all each other's saviors, that sort of thing. In a word, it sounds doable, though I hope I'm wrong. I predict it's a bit harder to envision the path from economic depression to a reaction to that depression that does not coincide with an increase in suicide and therefore arguably has suicide preventative qualities to it, to showing how aspects of this path transfer nicely to rape prevention. Let me assure you, though, that however curvy it is, there is a path, and I'm here to shine a flashlight on it. Really, though, if my rabbit trails don't stray too far, the main path should be visible from start to finish. One of these bunny trails has to do with the word coincidentally that I mentioned earlier in this video. Durkheim noted that just because two different sets of circumstances happened concurrently or contemporaneously, and they consistently happened at around the same time during different eras, we still don't necessarily know which one caused which. Or it could be that a third entity caused both. Some things we'll never know. But what we can know, Durkheim wrote, is that if the one never materializes without the other also showing up, we have to conclude they're at least associated with each other. Real-world example. Of the 208 women at the Chiefs game where I was able to see both of their hands, all 208 of them were neither carrying nor shaking keys. Also, of the thousands of women who at one point or another were near enough for me to hear if they shook their keys, none of them were making key-shaking noises. Of those of whom I was able to see one hand only, none of those hands were carrying keys either. Since there were no exceptions to this rule, since all 208 plus experiments had the same result, Durkheim, were he alive today, would say that we can at least assume association, if not more. This association could very well be that all those women were neither holding nor shaking their keys for the same reason. Perhaps they felt that any man who could afford to burn through upwards of $150 in one afternoon of frivolity and not have anything to show for it the next day other than, say, a hangover, is not very likely to rape them, if for no other reason than men with that kind of money are worth taking a chance on, if that chance presents itself, and they knew if they shook their keys at one of the carnies working there, selling hot dogs as it were, or perhaps cotton candy, that some eligible man nearby might be offended, i.e. collateral damage, and refrain from asking for a date. So even though they knew there was a smattering of low-income men about, they kept their keys out of sight and silent. To poo-poo association at this juncture is really stretching it. I think a very plausible case, actually, can be made not only for association, but causation as well. To wit, do keys float around, looking and seeking, searching for hands to hold them? No. Therefore, I think we can intelligently theorize that whatever causes millions of American women to hold and shake their keys at Walmarts also caused 208 out of 208 women at that Chiefs game to keep their keys in their pockets or purses or at home or in their car or somewhere other than at the ready. In the one petri dish, there are many low-income men milling about, getting ready to ask out women who clearly, in the minds of those women, know they can do much better, while in the other petri dish, there are almost no low-income men, and there are plenty of catches. But back to the main trail. It's here that Durkheim, while trying to show what the opposite societal effect of economic depression was, had to evaluate different historical players in terms of each other. But there was a problem. During an earlier time, one of the players, player X, was all there, while the other player, player Y, was more the beta version, or prototype, if you will, of what it would eventually become. Also, as time went by, as that prototype gradually became fully realized, the first player, Player X, gradually disintegrated into crumbs of its former self, and is now not really recognizable, at least not to most Americans, especially ones who've heard a thing or two about these crumbs. Here, I think a boxing metaphor might help. At times, boxing fans and pundits have clamored so vociferously for their favorite bruisers to meet in the ring that even though these pugilists' usual fighting weights diverged by as much as 30 pounds or better, their handlers convinced both to lose enough weight so that they could duke it out in a sanctioned fight, no less. Some of these fighters actually did rumble. What hasn't happened is for a featherweight born in the 18th century to fight a heavyweight born in the 20th. But that hasn't stopped columnists and bloggers and vloggers from speculating who would win, who was the better pound-for-pound puncher, and more. Durkheim measured the clout or punching power of pre-industrialists before the Industrial Revolution, and then he compared an estimate of their clout to another group's clout. More on this second group momentarily, but first, who were these pre-industrialists? They lived in the 16th, 17th, and the 18th centuries, and they owned regionally limited concerns. To say they owned factories, or that they were manufacturers, would be jumping the gun. What's crucial about these pre-industrialists, for our purposes, is that their control extended regionally, no further. This is before the inventions of the telegraph, the telephone, Twitter, what have you, and predated the development of modern management techniques, and, as travel was equine at best, it would take days to commute back and forth between two different concerns that weren't in the same region. So it just wasn't done. A fairly well-to-do pre-industrialist lived locally, hired locally, and sold his product locally. If he sold to a merchant who moved his product in, say, another nation, control over his wares stopped when that merchant handed over the cash. If he treated his workers poorly relative to other employers in that same region, word spread and boycotts happened successfully. This kind of arrangement is comparable to modern generals and privates having what they, almost to the man, currently don't have, namely, two-way communication, a topic addressed in Part 13 of this series. For example, if a road between workers' homes and that owner's factory or pre-factory fell into disrepair, that pre-industrialist, 1, heard about it, and 2, knew that for a tiny fraction of his net worth, that he could upgrade that road, thereby greatly pleasing his employees/customers, and subsequently grow his business faster and more efficiently. So that road work got done. After he, or his son, or his granddaughter, started owning factories, and yes, factories without the double quotes, in more than one region, and sometimes in more than one country, communication between industrialist and employee became more and more unidirectional, which is to say, a road in similar disrepair would go unfixed, commute time subsequently lengthened, worker dissatisfaction needlessly increased, and word of that quick, cheap fix would resonate from workers' lips, but not bounce off of owners' eardrums. That's enough for now for Player Y, the pre-industrialists. And, unfortunately, that's also going to have to do it for Part 18. In other words, we'll pick this one up right here, next time, in Part 19, or Pregnant Pause. No, wait, that's what this is. You are currently in the middle of a pregnant pause. La-di-da-di-da, right here, next time, in Part 19, or Toothless Eunuchs.